Here.
Mr. Neal?
Here.
Mr. Humphrey?
Present.
We have four.
All right, thank you, Ms. Barnett. Let's stand for pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Probably, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can. We hear the echo. All right. So why don't we proceed? We'll call this meeting today. Are we good? All right. Call this meeting today. This is one of maybe a couple open forums where we review the budget as part of a public session. Dr. Pusateri has prepared a preliminary budget for us and provided some analysis with some variances and so forth. But I'll yield the floor to Dr. Pusateri to make his presentation regarding our review of the budget.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Roberts. One of the goals of the strategic plan for the district and for the finance office is to continue to push for levels of transparency on how the district spends its money. It was suggested at last year's June board meeting that we set up a budget workshop before the board meeting, so that the board has time to sit with and digest and ask questions strictly on the budget instead of kind of adding it as a feature item. So I know this has happened in the past, but it's been in the last 5 years it hasn't. So I think it's a great practice to re-engage with. And certainly going forward, community members as well. And we're happy to have some staff here to engage as well, and as we try to continue to make this transparent. I'm going to kind of summarize some big picture ideas about summarize the budget itself and highlight some key numbers. I'm going to talk about kind of the message behind the budget. Then we'll go back into budget assumptions, which you might be familiar with from before. Federal pandemic relief funds, expenditures, which is a big part of our budget. Talk briefly about Prop V and construction, which is a big part of our budget. This is something stemming from the IBB and NEA discussions have been and at the board level as well, how can we continue to reallocate resources back to the school building? So there's a slide that talks a little bit about that, about some approaches that Dr. Ryder and I have identified in some initial conversations with principals and other spaces. And then finally, I'll walk through some selected variances between next year's budget and this year's. First, the projected end of year fund balance is about 17.7. That's a conservative number right now. We projected about this time last year, we projected this year's budget would also be right around 17.8. And we're at a solid 21.8 or so, right around 22. So that's a conservative number, but that's what we're looking like for next year. In 2018-19, the board set the goal to be around 15. Just to note that if we are higher than that, our S&P rating is better and we have better return on bonds. Operating revenue for this year. Operating revenue means money we don't spend on capital or debt service. It means we spend it on salaries, supplies, purchase services. We are looking to have about 49 million next year. That's down from about 53 million this year, and largely because we're starting to wean ourselves off of federal ESSER money. Operating expenses also are down. We're looking to spend about 51 million next year, and that's down from about 53 million for this year. Because our balance is operating budget is not balanced, it's intentionally unbalanced. We are spending more than we are taking in, but we're doing that intentionally to meet the district goals as our fund balances decrease. This is to meet our district priorities and our fund balance and to stay within our fund balance targets. We know that student achievement and the strategic plan delivery are the key goals for the district. It's important to note that we have over $5 million coming into operating revenue that's funded through ESSER 3. Here's a big headline though. If that ESSER 3 money weren't there, we'd have to pay for that ourselves at a state, local, or like federal title funds. And our budget, our fund balances would be closer to 10% if we bought everything that we want to buy next year, all the staff, all the FTEs, all the curricula, and we didn't have these ESSER funds in the operating budget. So that's a message to us. We have one more big year of ESSER after next year. That's 23-24. But by 24-25, we need to be planned to be fully not having any of that supplemental money. So we're really weaning ourselves as a metaphor that might work. We're stopping using this extra funds, and we need to be mindful of that. FTEs are a big one because they include not just salary, but also benefits and everything that goes with that. So the cabinet is striving to be disciplined, focused on any new FTE adds, which going forward, any new FTE adds will go before the board. That hasn't been the practice, but that all new adds or any new positions must be board reviewed and approved before. And further, we're thinking about attrition. So when somebody leaves, we need to think, is this a position that we really do need to fill? So those are the kind of the two guiding practices as we look at this longer term direction. Like I said, some of the main budget messages, what are the things going on in the school district that align with the budget? Well, certainly continued implementation of the strategic plan. That's kind of our guiding document, and that guides what we do. We all know that there's leadership transition coming, and as the interim superintendent is named, that interim direction, that person will be putting a stamp on how resources are spent and the direction that we go in. We need to continue to monitor enrollment and average daily attendance. It's been tricky with COVID because attendance has been varyingly difficult to track because of COVID and this year and in prior years. We think we'll start to come back to more of a normal level of attendance that's not affected by COVID coming up next year. We need to be mindful of FTEs, assignments, like I said, as well as staffing, and flexible. Some of this is tied to a superintendent who had one vision who has left, and as the board changes as well with the new superintendent, the assignments and the staffing of staff will shift to match the direction as it changes. And one of the main ways that we see it changing is increasing allocations to schools where possible, trying to be leaner generally at the central office level, while still delivering everything that we know that we need to deliver from the central office level. So cabinet members mindful of this need for flexibility.
Do we have a sense of a couple quick questions? So as we normalize our operating budget, are some of the expenditures that we're talking about, they're extraordinary, so they won't be ongoing. Therefore, we won't be operating in the red. Because when we talk about spending extra funds and how we prioritize, how we deploy those funds, we may buy down some things, we may take on some extraordinary expenditures. So just in layman's terms, does that mean that these extraordinary expenditures right now will normalize and then we'll be operating, as normal?
Yes and no. We're moving a number of IT purchases recently were one-time purchases for systems. Eventually, we will have to pay for upgrades, and that's further down the road. But we can look at creative uses of debt to cover that. We had just been paying it out of operating because we had the money. We just had been paying for it and not really using debt for those big purchases. Staffing. Dr. Ryder's here in the room. We've been strategic, recognizing the new rigorous curricula, especially in math and in EL. We had staffed the leads with the particular role of equipping our teachers with the role of better understand how to implement this rigorous curriculum. And Dr. Ryder and Marcus and the team had developed a plan to eventually shift those leads to other spaces once the full support for curriculum has kind of petered out after not this coming year, but the following year will be the kind of the final year for that. So that's the plan. But managing that strategically is what's currently in place. Is that enough? I don't think it's enough. I think we still need to do more to continue to get leaner, to make sure we're confident and comfortable and we're closer to that 15% mark. I think if we only did that, we'd be closer to maybe 13. And we want to be a little higher than that. Does that answer your question?
It does. And then the other two questions that are, I think, rhetorical for now, but really I want to try to better understand is that when you made the comment about current administration may change in terms of the priorities of the next superintendent, and that there was some, perhaps we may have had more been top heavy, for lack of better terms, on the administration side. Do we have a sense of what kind of magnitude we're talking about that would be, move from one structure to another, albeit efficient, but there's got to be some benefit to that, either savings or what have you. Do we have a sense of that, or will we be able to gain a sense of that?
One example would be the high school. Last board meeting, Dr. Douglas gave an extensive presentation on some of the challenges and some of the great needs of the high school. And the need to demand, there's a funding aspect to helping to address that, or resources that aspect. I believe that the staff at the central office is ready to serve children and ready to serve at the direction of board and the superintendent, and is flexible and willing to roll where best needed. Just as we did under Marcus Robinson, we served as we were called to serve. I believe that the staff is ready to roll and be reallocated. For example, the high school and the CASA program. Dr. Douglas presented on the CASA program, and I understand that there is a shortage. There's been a number of staff changes there right now. So that's a place where some highly talented folks could go and serve well. And there's some work ahead of us as we map that out, how to best fill that. And if possible, it could be folks from central office.
Okay. And my last global comment is that one of the things I've been trying to understand since I've been here is that how do we deploy our resources so we get the biggest value, the biggest bang for our buck that translates into the students, and that ties to our strategic plan. So I think it's really it'd be really helpful for you all to help us understand that if we're budgeting something and we spend it on a program, how does that translate into value and improvement for ultimately our students?
Key guiding question. Dr. Ryder's team continually evaluates the curriculum and instruction outcomes. We as a cabinet are committed to pushing in front of the board on a more regular basis academic outcomes and how our investments in academics are translating. So you can expect on a monthly basis, for the foreseeable future, an update from Dr. Ryder that shows one aspect of that. But it's not just about curriculum instruction. There's other ways to measure outcomes. We're going to be continuing to look at support services and seeing what are ways we can support our students that may not necessarily be teaching and learning related, but more basic needs, and how are the monies that we're putting in supporting. For example, the investment in uniforms. It's a sizable $500,000 investment, but what are the outcomes that we're seeing going into our third year with that program? How's that translating? Sometimes we don't have, the data is incomplete, and we're just doing what we can with the data that we have, but it's still important that we share that data.
Well, I think one of the questions I wanted to talk a little bit about when you talk about CASA.
Is your mic on?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, cool.
One of the things about CASA is that we really have to look at organizationally, what do we want alternative school to look like? And that's going to have some budgetary considerations because, you're looking at CASA at the high, there's CASA at the high school, which is a behavioral component as well as an academic, but you're also going to need to do the same thing at the elementary level because the principals at that level have been saying that there's some level of alternative school that's needed, both behavioral and academic. And so organizationally, we need to know what that design looks like because it's going to require some dollars to be put to that to be able to make it, meet the needs because, the earlier CASA was dismantled for a couple of some safety reasons and some other things around not having enough support around SSD students that were there. And so that's a piece of it as well. When we have kids that are in SSD that find themselves in alternative school, how do we make sure that we have adequate support so that we're maximizing the fact that they're having to use that alternative form of education. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, I think we, this is a great time to talk a little bit about the transition team's work in terms of what you're speaking to and what we want to do in terms of being a good steward over the dollars and making sure that the budget is spent with a direct impact to student achievement. We have to go back to the cause of some of the issues and things that we're having. For example, we need to make sure that we have in place building leadership and building teams that understand that engaging students in instruction, because high quality instruction is being delivered, That's the biggest piece of remedying discipline problems and the need for alternative school. So before we start just planning alternatives, let's just make sure that everything is in place first that addresses what's causing that problem and contributing to that need. Once we address what's contributing to the need and cause the problem, then that better informs what needs to happen going forward.
And what I'm suggesting, I'm not saying it's an either or, I'm saying it's both.
Absolutely.
We have to do both.
Yeah, we have to do both. In addition to that, when you go past that piece in terms of what we want costs to look like in the budgetary piece, what costs needs to look like should complement a structure at the high school. And right now, when we look at our most recent regional review from the desk area supervisor, the structure that should be in place at the high school may be lacking. And then that causes concern for how we develop costs. So what we're looking at is taking our lead from the strategic plan and looking at the wraparound services that need to occur at high school to address things like average daily attendance percentage, which Dr. Busateri has mentioned in his presentation, to protect things like the number of disciplinary infractions that lead to suspensions, which then negatively impacts the average daily attendance percentage and ultimately impacts student performance. So looking at those wraparound services and creating a structure that's going to best support kids so that we can offset the problems before we have them. In essence, in order to protect the budget, we're looking at prevention first. What can we do with what we already have to prevent some of the issues that are leading to expenditures? If we can use prevention to downplay the need for expenditures first, then have a real look at what we need to spend things on, have a real fine-tuned sense of what we need to do.
Right, and
What does that look like?
That's a great question. What that looks like is, for example, you will have an assistant principal at the freshman level, a counselor at the freshman level, and then a family engagement liaison at the freshman level. That trio of individuals, that trio of wraparound services will occur for freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And so now you create the opportunity for a trio of individuals to work with a caseload of students, if you will, and then become resident experts in what needs to happen at that particular class level. For example, if you are the freshman AP working with a freshman counselor and a freshman family engagement liaison, then you already know that part of your work is to get to know the 8th graders throughout the district before they come to the high school. You're going to know their average daily attendance percentages because part of the work of those family engagement liaisons is to increase average daily attendance percentage. You're going to have their discipline profiles. You're going to know about off-task and disruptive behaviors. You're going to know about days of suspension. So part of the work of that trio of wraparound services to make sure that if we had an average of X number of days of instruction lost because of suspension, how do we decrease that number of days, instructional days lost because of suspension? And now that structure gives us the supports in place for the students. It gives the high school staff the supports. Everybody identifies with who they are and they know that that's who they need to go to and who they need to approach. We create the opportunity to have those resident experts at every class level. So what can happen? If we start with 123 freshmen, the goal of that trio of individuals and the goal of those wraparound services is to say that the freshman class started with 123 and we're handing 123 off to the sophomore class. That's the kind of scaffolding and vertical alignment these wraparound services are intended to build.
That sounds great. And we also look at other schools that have similar programs that are making some progress in this area. As an example, University City is making great strides as we going to look at some of the areas.
That's exactly what we're taking a lead from, and thankful to our partners at Beyond Housing. They've done a lot of this work for us. which is why we're looking to expand the memo of understanding between us with regard to the family education liaisons. And so with community partners that really are supporting the work that we do, they kind of go out, and I had a meeting, Ron and I had a meeting just yesterday to really review a lot of the great groundwork and groundswell of information that they've uncovered as to how this is really going to work for our students.
Okay, I think we'll have more opportunity to have this kind of dialogue because it's important. Go ahead, and then I think some of the things you're hearing, you'll be able to illuminate those throughout your presentation, right?
Right. Okay. As we talk about shifting resources to buildings, our first focus is at the high school. We could, not in a financial position to have all of this reallocation of additional resources to all the other buildings at this time. But we feel like that's our place to really focus on at this point, especially based on the recent data that Dr. Dunn shared before at the last meeting. Plus, we have our huge capital investments that are occurring at the high school as well, which we're happy to say that, look, we can see progress moving forward. Certainly the timetable hasn't worked as we'd expected, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but a good, next year we'll wrap up almost all of our spending on construction in the high school. We still need to finalize the architect for the new West Gym, but I'll continue talking about that a little bit. Okay, you're familiar with these, but I felt like it's important to bring this back up with the budget workshop. The large budget assumptions include the large pay increase for teachers, nearly 6%. That's on top of the 5% increase from the prior year. We want teachers to know, and everybody paid in the teacher scale, which includes many others that were not teachers, to know that we value them. And further, we bumped the pay for senior teachers so that if you've been with us for 30 years and have a doctorate, you can earn it over $115,000 with national board certification. That was something that the JEGB team and Mr. Robinson and Mr. Humphrey helped bring forward, and we're grateful for the moves that were made there. The board and Mr. Robinson also helped us move forward with a classified and admin pay increase corrections last year. So everybody starts at $15 an hour with a food service custodial. We believe that while we're not exactly sure that's exactly where we think everyone should be, and we'd love to go higher, we do think we were the first district in the region to hit that $15 an hour minimum, and that's been increased budget cost for us this year. All other staff just received a 2.25% one step increase. We want to continue to protect staff from the rising costs of medical and dental insurance, and at this budget has the board taking on the 100% of that, about approximately 9% increase. Not spreading the wealth among the employees. In future years, that may be something we need to look at, where the board takes on some and the employees see some increases as well. Mr. Robinson and the board last year helped bring the costs down. We not only improved services, but we also decreased costs. And you usually don't see any organization do both of those things in 1 year. We'll be moving more money over to capital, more tax money, so we can choose what fund that goes to, because we want to make sure we have enough funds to finish all the Prop V and West Gym work, which means there's less money coming into revenue. There were a number of new FTEs added last fiscal year. We want to make sure we continue to support those that weren't in last year's budget. Uniforms, and then we're adding 5 new pre-K TAs. For revenue, some big assumptions are that we'll continue to receive our ADA money from 2019-20, thanks to DESE. They've allowed 1 more year for us to carry that enrollment. Transportation is fully funded, which will help us by about $600,000, significant increase by the legislature, although the legislature says don't expect it after this year. So we can look at that as a one-time expense. This budget does not have the opportunity trust in it. For a couple of years, it was about $500,000. This year, it's about $225,000. And next year's budget assumes that there is no revenue coming in from the Opportunity Trust. Pandemic money. We're grateful for all the support, as schools have been one of the safest places and most important places during the pandemic for children. We strive to have students in school, and we were one of the only districts to start 2020 with students on site, especially in pre-K through 5. But we recognize there's been tremendous learning loss. And so much of the money is dedicated to learning loss. And for us this year, we have about $5 million in operating to support learning loss, including tutoring, before school and after school care, something that was recently set up, the weekend credit recovery programming that Dr. Douglas set up at the high school. Our counselors are now funded, through ESSER learning loss. Our whole support services department is funded through ESSER. Curriculum staff is also funded through ESSER. Professional development and ed technology. These are the items that we want, the expenditure spaces where we want to be thinking about bringing away from ESSER in the future. So we're zeroed in on these.
I do have a question. With the 5.2, that's all of those things are student-driven kind of costs that are under ESSER. But for the sake of conversation, ESSER is going to go away. And everything that's listed under there is a critical need for students. So will our budget be able to support that 5 million once ESSER goes? Because to me, it's kind of tricky when you fund budgetary things through grant dollars, because when those grant dollars dry up, the need is still there. So we really need to look at how are we going to maintain our level of services for students once ESSER goes away. Because the student need won't go away because that's what money did.
We're intentionally looking at reallocating the curriculum and professional development team to phase away from the leads teaching teachers to migrating over to reading specialists or open assistant principal positions if there are any. But that's a specific space where we have talented staff. And we want to make sure that everybody, and we can guarantee everyone a work home, but we do see that position phasing out.
Right, but I guess my biggest thing is that because that money is allocated for learning loss, and having looked at the data for 8th grade kids going into the high school next year, the need for dollars to support learning loss is going to be greater, not less. And so we just want to make sure that when that money goes away, we have a plan to support student services around academics, because it's going to be critically needed.
The board's decision to be as safe as we could be, we could look at West Gym and scaling it back from the 6 million or 5.5 million. But right now the plan is to move forward with it as a critical need. That somehow in the beginning of Prop V, it was decided that we didn't need that gym. Soon after we moved forward with it. And that would allow some safety. Again, like I said earlier, we are intentionally ramping down our ESSER funding and taking steps to ensure we'll be okay, but we'll need to take further steps.
Right, but I guess that once again, not to beat the dead horse as it were, but anytime we take academic dollars and tie them to grants, we create an issue for ourselves when those dollars go away. And the West Gym issue is critically needed because those 2 smaller gyms in East are gone, and they won't have enough floor space for the various programs. That's why those gyms are needed. So we gotta figure out how to keep learning loss. Basically, it boils down to start and stop. What do we start? What do we stop? In order to be, because at the end of the day, the whole school district is about kids and academics. And so how do we make them successful?
So noted.
Yeah. I think what Dr. Pusateri is saying is that our biggest expense is coming from FTEs. And so what we need to do is monitor the FTEs, and as it relates to the resulting academic need, that need is predicated upon accountability. Those folks that are already in place, are they being held accountable to deliver? And as that accountability increases, it will then foreshadow for us and forecast for us what our true FTE needs are. And so Dr. Pusateri is saying that we're going to look critically at those FTEs and those identified departments. We're going to be looking at strategically making sure that there's an accountable impact directly related to student achievement. And as that clears the sky for us, we'll know what FTEs are needed and what FTEs we can kind of start to do this controlled spend down.
One of the reasons why learning loss is tied to these ESSER funds is because it's required. 20% of ESSER 3 funds must be spent towards learning loss. So curriculum, professional learning directly tied to it. So we went ahead and
right. I was aware of that. My concern is that at some point the money's going to go away. It's supporting some very valuable services, and we got to keep the kids in the forefront. How do we maintain a level that's going to help them move forward? Because we got some challenges in the pipeline.
Absolutely. For one specific example would be, let's say that an EL lead were to resign and move to another district, there's an opening. Our current plan is to fill that opening for next year. However, as I'm new in this seat as chief administrator, my first thought was, let me think about that. Is it possible that this is one we don't fill through attrition? I had dialogue with Dr. Ryder. Dr. Ryder says, we did commit to this. This is in the budget, and we need this full amount of staff to finally deliver the curricular goals that we have. That's one less lead to help teachers learn the EL needs that they need. So that's a decision we're looking at every time there is a vacancy. We'll look and make that tough decision on whether filling it is appropriate. Okay. Moving on, Prop V. We do have investments there. The total projected cost is approaching about 44 million. West Gym estimate is maybe 5.5 for now. We've got some great responses to our RFQ for architects. And Ron, I'll be looking to you to give feedback on that and look at the committee as we interview those. And it's scheduled, it looks like at the next board meeting, we'll bring that before you. The completion dates are in the right-hand column. Certainly we're frustrated with some of these supply chain, and frankly, there's been some staffing on our architecture team where we feel like there were some gaps. But the end is getting closer to being in sight. But this is continues to be a huge focus for our budget moving forward. Notice that bottom number is about 44 million on expenditures, but notice our sources are more than that on the next page. So that's the key. We just continue to draw on Normandy capital funds and Normandy and ESSER funds. And then there's West Gym as a next step from additional ESSER funds. Let's talk about allocating resources to school buildings. In conversations I've had with board members and with the NEA committee, we've identified that, again, like Mr. Humphrey said, we want to continue to allocate resources there. Dr. Ryder and I have had initial conversations, and Dr. Ryder's had her own as well. And we've identified through an initial steps in the needs assessment that TAs in buildings, we're struggling filling teacher positions. It makes logical sense to say, you know, if we actually, our goal is to be 100% staff with certified folks. At the same time, if we do add a TA to that grade level, it could add a greater level of support. This is from a principal speaking, to support that grade level to be successful, whether they're working with students one-on-one, but TAs are something that we're looking at. Reading specialists, migrating back to reading specialists. When the EL leads came, we stopped. Our philosophy was that teachers would be the primary teachers of reading to children. But Dr. Ryder is leading us with the vision to say eventually we'll migrate back to reading specialists because it's needed. Behavior interventionists, that also came up in, other interventionists also came up in the union talks. Next year's budget has approximately, has 6 figures set aside for the interim superintendent to allocate in the contingency fund. Usually the contingency fund is there every year anyway to cover unforeseen expenses. But in this case, particularly, there's additional contingency funds available for the interim to allocate towards these resources that can go directly into the buildings. And just to share, like we said, all cabinet members are ready. We're kind of folks and soldiers willing to serve where needed and where we're called. And ideally, it matches our strengths, but we may be reallocated to school buildings in certain cases.
Comment or question. I know there had been some conversation around, I know the teachers, you know, we had a situation where throughout the school year, we had at least 21 teacher vacancies, not counting the subs that are in buildings. And there had been some discussion about looking into piping in virtual instructions from other locations from certified teachers in those places that we don't have a certified teacher. And I think part of that was having a teacher aide in the room and having that virtual instruction piped in to be able to kind of increase, because right now I anticipate unless we do something differently, we're going to have a shortage of teachers going into next year. And looking at that virtual pipeline for certified instruction might be an option to kind of look at. I don't know how it would be structured, but we got to figure out a way to ramp up the level of instruction in the classroom, and we can't totally depend on substitutes to do it.
Thank you for that. Make a note and we'll talk more about that. It was suggested that I share more clearly the district's kind of dependency on consultants. And I'll share in my 5 years here, going on 6, I think we're less dependent than we have been. When I started, the CFO himself was a full-time consultant. He did a good job, and the hiring HR director was, as was before that, the assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction. I feel like that we are continuing to evaluate our consultants and eliminate them as needed. For example, next year, there's a finance and operations consultant, a retired superintendent who next year's contract, which will be before board approval, he's paid only as needed. And I may go months without calling. And then if I need to call for a quick question, he'll bill me for 30 minutes for a call. But we feel like that's a way to allow the resource to be here without, we've discontinued our HR consultants. We hired Dr. Barnes as a consultant after he left us to finish, to help with some things related to principal eval. That won't be continued. Dr. Douglas has made a request well, actually it's not just Dr. Douglas. We have, we all know, some of us know Desiree Green, who offered a lot at the high school, and she was our CTE Perkins coordinator, and she's retired. And so one approach we're looking at that is to see if there is a consultant we know who might be able to cover that. So Dr. Douglas is working with Ms. Jameson to put together a proposal for the board on that. Yes. But I think we could talk to Dr. Douglas. The higher it is, if we're satisfied, typically our roles on continuations are, we may need to rebid or requote and seek other folks if the consultant wasn't.
Well, see, I always thought, and I'll just be real quick on that, when that person was actually consulting at the high school, the intent of them being there was capacity building so that they would build out the structure and then they would no longer be needed. So the question is, what is the work plan going forward, and when do they get to the end of the work that they were charged to do? So.
Yeah, and I think this is a different topic that's just CTE related, but I think that's a good point. Our pre-auditor technically is a consultant, and I strongly believe that we need to keep that. Helps it anytime we have a financial compliance question, we're able to call, and then they go through before the auditor.
Who's providing that service for us?
It was Showalter and Jabouri. Showalter and Jabouri called and said, you know what, we're at a capacity space and we're going to have to break up with you essentially. And so we did then call the guy who used to be president of Showalter and Jabouri, who retired. His name is Jim Torty. Jim Torty works through LDR, which is a consultancy firm that provided Randall Charles. So we pay LDR, but it's Jim, who was our old pre-auditor, and now he's back. And he's great. You can ask our finance team and our HR team.
Issue around consultancy is that I wanted us to keep a focus on that so that if we get to a point we're starting to look at FTEs, I'd rather us look at eliminating consultants before you start eliminating staff working with kids. So we just need to see what that looks like.
Right, and that's why I put this here. I think the headline that I want to share with you is that we are about as lean as we can be for consultants. I feel like that there's some really specialized areas like pre-auditor, core data. We had a brand new core data person this year who moved into the role without any experience. And because we can let school district live and die by core data, is what a mentor of mine used to say. We felt like it was real important to have a consultant available who's a retired core data specialist on that. So my opinion is that we're as lean as we can be. I'd be happy to talk to offline if you want to do a deeper dive on that in that area. Let's talk about budget variances. There's about 1,500 lines on the final document, and the board members put this on earlier some days ago. But on the far right-hand column, there's some listing of some variances, and just pointing out some of the major changes from next year's budget from this year's budget. On revenue, I had already mentioned these earlier in the assumptions. We're moving tax revenue from operating to capital, about $500,000. Opportunity trust revenue, about $250,000. The assumption is it's not going to be in there. There is a grant from special school district, and we intend to use that to cover 2 full-time equivalents this coming year, which will be about $90,000. State transportation is fully funded, which is about $600,000. And then we'll be reducing our ESSER operating revenue by about $3 million. So those are some of the big variances with regard to revenue. With regard to expenses, we are migrating. So some of this weaning is happening where we're moving expenses to local and title funds, about $3 million. So we are kind of getting off of the ESSER source. We're increasing contingency funds slightly. So there'll be about $500,000 there. Last year, I believe we started with about $350,000 in contingency. There won't be, in August, as everybody came back from the pandemic, most folks were remote and everybody was coming back full time for the first time. There was a professional development in August that, and we paid staff. It was extra pay, extra duty that they volunteered for to attend, and they were trained and they received a payout there, and that won't be occurring this year. There's some other cost reductions. Normandy High School furniture purchase is nearly complete. We see ourselves ramping down on curriculum and instruction, school kit, and some other expenses that have been in place for a couple of years. We feel like we kind of got what we need from them. IT equipment, Dr. Green is kind of ahead of schedule a lot of times, and some of the things that I had shared as being on the budget and notified the board are in the budget for next year. I gave authorization to just go ahead and make some of those purchases, and the board had approved them in the meetings to get them early before Dr. Green leaves the district. So as a result, a lot of the IT purchases that Terry kind of meant to spend next year out of the budget, they're already taken care of out of this year's budget. So a pretty sizable reduction in IT, which would be good for us next year. Tuition reimbursement, the transfer program, tuition reimbursement. There's about $210,000 that we gave away this year as a one-year exception to the policy, where we basically reimbursed everybody 100%. And it wasn't a policy; it was a procedure. We're going to be going back to the procedure where this is prorated, and that'll save about $210,000. And then we're also happy there'll be about $80,000 saved because we won't be paying out the transfer program. And those of you who have been here since the beginning, Mr. Humphrey might be, and I know Dr. Petty was here a while ago as well, but might remember those days when we first started paying in the millions for the transfer program. I think there's a certain amount of celebration that there's no more money going out the door to pay other districts for students who live here going elsewhere. And we know this was a huge part of the board finance update in the past. That concludes the variance. That also concludes the presentation that I have. And this is an open time for questions if you have any. But I feel like in general, you gave a summary and a walkthrough of the budget so that on Tuesday, you will have already had a chance to review and evaluate the budget before you.
Thank you, Dr. Pusateri. Now open it up. Any questions, comments, concerns, discussion?
I did have one question. I guess as we're looking at the budget considerations of allocating, I know we're increasing.
There we go. Okay, I guess in particular, when we look at the FTEs of the APs, I noticed what was happening at the high school where there's one at each of the grade levels. But I also know, having looked at the data at the elementary level, there doesn't appear to be a balance or an equity around some of the schools in terms of the number of APs that are assigned based on last year's data. Because in particular, I think there's, 3 APs at Lucas Crossing. I think there's 2 at Barack Obama. I believe there's 2 at Washington. And I think for some reason, Jefferson, which had a pretty high behavioral number, only had one AP, and I didn't know if how we looked at that in terms of equity, because I know that the workload doesn't diminish. I understand what we're doing at the high school, but I also know that we need to make sure that there's a level of equity at all of the campuses. And so I think we need to take a look to see if there's something we could do there to make sure that all of the schools are feeling equally supported. So,
Well, what we're doing is, first of all, looking historically at what was assigned and matching what was assigned historically with student population. So if you take, for example, Lucas Crossing, there historically there have been high times where Lucas Crossing had in excess of 1,000 kids, and it was well run with one principal and 3 assistant principals. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at to make sure that we balance those allocations out. We're going to look at the number of students assigned to all of the schools and make sure that the leadership is in place to address any and all needs with regard to student services and student safety. Again, behavior issues are not just germane to a lack of staff. Behavior issues have a lot to do with classroom climate, school culture, engaging instruction, student engagement in classroom activities, and all of those things. And so we have to look at the causal issues, not just, you know, how do we respond? We have to look at what's causing some of these issues. And that too is going to be helpful in guiding where we place individuals.
right, but it's still the fundamental issue is equity and assignment. That's the
And
issue I'm looking
I
at.
can respond a little bit to that too. Every year we do keep a table of the number of staff, the number of leadership supports that are there, the ratio of leadership supports per student, and then the DESE recommended ratio. We understand and we believe that it's important to have more than the DESE ratio, but it is something that we're mindful of. We make improvements and corrections. So for example, for Jefferson, they went from, I don't know if their dean is as certified as an administrator, but they went from a dean who's 10 months and, you know, on a teacher scale and has the expectations of a 10-month person to having a 12-month assistant principal who is paid on an admin scale and is certified as an admin, and so can support the principal in suspensions that a dean maybe wasn't certified to issue, as well as support the principal with regard to teacher evaluation. I understand that the request might be, you might have heard a request to say, you know what, we had no assistant principals, now we want 2. And I might have heard that too, but I think it's okay to say, here's our numbers, and I do have a table that has the numbers. This is our decision and this is our cutoff. At the same time, there is that $500,000 or additional money for the superintendency contingency to allocate resources as needed. Perhaps there's something else that could help a building that needs it. And I think Dr. Ryder and I have been working with the principals to try to identify whether it's behavior interventionist. This is intended for the interim superintendent to kind of steer that ship, but the creation of the budget, those additional funds were present to go to the buildings just to kind of support on the ground needs. My recommendation is not to add a second assistant principal at Jefferson at this time.
Well, I think a lot of my conversation was more data-driven than historical practice.
And it's based on the numbers.
Right, I was looking at when you look across the data landscape of all schools,
Yeah.
you know, what does that data say we should be doing? And that's what I was looking at. It has nothing to do with how many people we've historically had in one spot. Is, you know, what level of support do we need to have based on the activity that's there? So at this point, I won't belabor it, but I think that's an issue that we really do need to take a look at, you know.
Thank you.
Well, we have to take a look at what the data is telling us. Data doesn't tell us everything, it tells us something. And we have to clearly identify specifically what the data is telling us. And that information is what should guide our decisions as it relates to budget and spending dollars.
Well,
So it's not just historical, it's data, it's all of these things combined. But the research is clear that when you start talking about discipline problems and behavior issues in the school, that goes back to culture and climate. It has very little to do with assigning extra bodies.
Well, and like I said, you know, it's not meant to be argumentative or anything like that, but there's issues around if behavior management is an issue across the district, not just at any particular school, then are we allocating the right amount of dollars around professional development and the other things to make sure that when teachers show up, they're equipped to minimize some of the stuff? Because I think a lot of the dynamics that's happening at the elemental schools is because you've picked up the upper grades that elementary principals were not really fully prepared to have. They're not middle school principals. And so there's a dynamic there that you have to look at. How is that impacting the day-to-day around operations, and how do we budget to deal with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we have to, what we want to need in order for us to make decisions at the board level is how we prioritize. That's what we're talking about, priority. And you have to establish and find a base somewhere, because otherwise we will find ourselves in shooting and moving targets. So we got to set the target somewhere.
Right.
You got to understand the base. And just like we are, there's some extraordinary expenditures because our base was pre-pandemic, pandemic hit, and then it exacerbated and compounded some things. But the reality is we have to determine what that base is. Presumably our strategic plan helps us to prioritize how we're going to do our base. And then therefore we'll take the resources and the budget exercise and allocation of resources will help us to determine what the administration is doing as it relates to our base and improving our base to get us to where we're trying to go, and how we make decisions as a board to help govern that process. So I think what I'm hearing implicitly is that I don't think we're working towards understanding what our base is. And that's the fundamental yet expedient question we have to answer moving forward. What is our base? What are we prioritizing? Is there refinement in terms of what our plans are tied to, our budget? That's what we're going through. But then we have to set the mark somewhere, and then throughout the year, there may be some adjustments made, but at least we're starting somewhere. Any other comments? I think a couple comments in terms of, and I think you broke this down, but in the potential impact of reduction in consultancy, is it, am I reading this correctly? It might be to the tune of $300,000, or do you have an order of magnitude of that in terms of what are you targeting in terms of a reduction in economic impact?
Oh, over a 5-year period, I would six figures.
Okay.
So if you're thinking of mid for the mid-teens, I believe we're about
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then another one on when we talk about principal, you said principal evaluations. Tell me a little bit more about that. So we have principal evaluations, and then we engage. I'm a little unclear about that. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
I understand Dr. Barnes was charged to evaluate principals, individual and ordinary principals. Dr. Barnes was second superintendency out of state. We started February 1. And from what I understand, the evaluations were complete, but he had the most knowledge, and he had already gathered the data, and so and it was a board-approved contract with Dr. Barnes to go ahead and pay him a certain amount of money to finish up those evaluations and so on.
Are they done?
I looked at Dr. Rowland.
I have Dr. Barnes' draft, but I haven't been given the green light to enter them into the licensing system yet.
Okay. How much did that cost us?
If I recall, was it 13,000?
13,000.
Okay. All right. So, okay. Any issues with that, or concerns, or anything you needed, or?
I mean, I guess what he was supposed to do is complete. But I haven't been given a green light internally to enter them into the Whetstone system, which is the official evaluation system.
Who gives you the green light? Where does that come from?
Well, it was Marcus, and I was told that Roz and Sarah were having some conversation about the evaluation, so we just need to circle back and make sure that what I have is the final copy before I enter them into Whetstone, because all I have is what Dr. Barnes CC'd me on when he sent them to each principal.
are these evaluations, if we use these evaluations to determine, to make decisions on what?
I can't answer what they used them for last year, but principal evaluation should be accurate based on data and interactions with principals to make a decision on renewal, non-renewal, coaching, types of coaching.
Renewal, non-renewal contracts?
Yes.
So, when was the deadline for that? Yeah, good question.
Typically, we follow what the deadline is for teachers, but I think it's legally a little bit different. You know, the actual deadline.
Because it should be somewhere well in advance of the contract.
Yeah. It should all of it should be done right now.
It's my understanding that I'm going to not have the qualifications to do that.
Was certified, he certified it in Missouri. I'm not sure about the certification, if he had an admin or soup.
I'm just putting it out there. I think this conversation is probably more appropriate when we do the next section.
Okay, so just point of clarification, this is a personnel issue because of what?
We're just trying to clarify,
Someone failed to do their job.
Yeah, but the scope of this became a contractual consultancy rather than an employee that we approved.
True.
So how is it? I mean, I'm not disagreeing, I'm trying to understand. So that,
We were having conversations about, in a global sense about evaluations that impact individuals. And in my understanding, if you're gonna have personnel conversations, it should not necessarily be an open meeting.
okay, so I get that.
Because when we get to the nuance of what you're looking at, is probably gonna require a different level of conversation about individuals.
Sure, so what I'm asking is, it's a contractual agreement that we have for someone to perform assistant principal evaluations. That's not done. That should have been done in advance of contracts. And
It sounds like it's done, it has whatever the last step in the Redstone has.
they're not complete.
Right.
We don't have completed, so it's not done.
Well, she said that, what she said was that there were two people having an additional conversation about those evaluations. One of those two people actually has support responsibility for principals, and that's probably the reason why they just need to tie the bow of that process to get finalized.
Do we have work product based on a contract for someone to deliver services for us that we can, if we were requested to have? That's been approved.
Yes, we have his evaluations that he completed on each principal.
And what's the bottleneck? I'm just maybe
The bottleneck is, the evaluation has to be entered into the web system. That's the official system, and frankly, I don't know if, closing conversations happen with Dr. Lawrence and each principal, because that should have been a part of it. I do have the written documents from Dr. Lawrence, but as far as for the conference, no, each principal, did he sign off, did they sign off, the actual, documents and policies, I don't know if that happens specifically.
Okay. Dr. Pusateri, when can you bring will you be able to get some closure to this so that we can understand what we're discussing right now by the next board meeting?
Or sooner, as Mr. Humphrey suggested.
You can shorten and run with as much as you like.
Okay. I think we can get some clarity. Yes.
All right. Any other questions regarding the budget, Dr. Pusateri's presentation? There's no actions for voting, it's just getting it all out so we can, continue the budgeting process.
This is very helpful.
All right. Well, if no other questions, comments, concerns, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting, and then we'll close out. I'll just ask Ms. Barnett just close us out with a roll call vote.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, let me get the vote, the motion. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. It's been moved and properly seconded by Tony Neal that we adjourn. Can you close us out with roll call?
Roberts?
Here.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. This is really, really, really helpful.
Thanks for recommending we do it. Should be done each year.